Everyone's heard of Atlantis. It's an overpriced resort in the Bahamas, the home address of Aquaman, namesake of a surprising number of aquatic-themed strip clubs, and, of course, a mythical ancient city that ended up very wet. Atlantis, in short, has great brand recognition, but there seems to be quite a bit of popular confusion about where the story of Atlantis comes from, whether Atlantis was real, and why people make such a big deal about this soggiest of civilizations. Clarifying all this sounds like a job for questions about ancient Greece and Rome you were afraid to ask in school. As my dedicated band of subscribers knows, the videos on this channel are usually short, sweet, and self-contained. For the next 3 episodes, however, I'd like to try something different, a sort of mini-series on Atlantis. This first video will discuss the origins of the Atlantis story. The second will explore modern quests for Atlantis. The third will focus on the theory that the Atlantis story was inspired by a colossal Bronze Age eruption. Together, these videos will hopefully provide a fast-paced but reasonably thorough overview of the myth and mystique of Atlantis. So, without any further ado, let's dive in. The story of Atlantis begins with Plato. Plato was born into one of Athens' leading families. He was a brilliant student, a gifted poet, and a champion wrestler. With this resume, he seemed destined for great things, until he fell under the unlikely spell of Socrates. At first glance, Socrates was far from inspiring. He was long-haired, unkempt, and considered the ugliest man in Athens. Since he refused to engage in a profession other than philosophy, he spent most of his time strolling barefoot in public places, engaging anything that stood still long enough in endless discussions about courage, piety, and the like. To Plato and a small group of other philosophically inclined youths, he was a fascinating friend and inspiring teacher. Most other Athenians, however, regarded him as a nuisance and a potential menace. In 399 BC, during a period of political unrest, a jury condemned Socrates to death on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Though able to escape, he chose to accept the penalty, and, after about a month in prison, he calmly drank a fatal dose of hemlock. The execution of Socrates convinced Plato to devote his life to philosophy. Inspired by the Socratic habit of seeking truth through discussion, Plato presented his ideas in the form of dialogues, that is, conversations between 2 or more characters. The most important speaker is almost always Socrates. Plato himself never appears. The reader is simply presented with a long and detailed discussion of some philosophical concept, and left to puzzle out its implications as best he can. This format allowed Plato to explore complex issues without committing himself to a single interpretation. Equally importantly, it drew readers into the conversation, urging them to consider the issues at stake for themselves. The 2 dialogues that describe Atlantis, the Timaeus and the Critias, are among the last Plato wrote. Both reflect his deep interest in politics. Earlier in his career, in his famous Republic, Plato had described a utopian society. In his old age, however, he seems to have become increasingly interested in the practical problems of governing a city. The Timaeus and the Critias are products of this new approach to the perfect state. The Timaeus, presented as a continuation of the Republic, features Socrates and 3 other characters. Socrates begins the dialogue by summarizing the ideal society outlined in the Republic. Their discussion, he suggests, is incomplete, since they have yet to consider how effective such a city would be in a crisis. One of the other characters, Critias, replies that he knows a relevant example. An ancestor of his, Critias continues, once visited Egypt. There his ancestor fell into discussion with some priests, who told him that their records preserved many things the Greeks had long since forgotten. 9,000 years before, the priest said, Athens had been a great city. The ancient Athenians had performed many noble deeds, but their most famous exploit was the defeat of the mighty empire of Atlantis. The Atlanteans, the priest continued, came from a great island in the far west, and had conquered much of Europe and North Africa. When they sought to add Greece to their empire, however, the Athenians repeatedly defeated them, and finally led a war to liberate Europe from Atlantean tyranny. Not long after this victory, both ancient Athens and Atlantis were destroyed by terrible earthquakes and floods. A few Athenians survived by fleeing to the mountains, but Atlantis was destroyed utterly and sank beneath the waves. Critias provides more detail in the next dialogue, which is named after him. Atlantis, he says, was founded by Poseidon, god of the sea, who set 10 of his mortal sons on the thrones of its 10 kingdoms. To the eldest of his children, Poseidon gave an awesome natural fortress, surrounded by concentric moats of seawater. This became the heart of the Atlanteans' greatest city, and was duly crowned with a great temple of Poseidon. Around the metropolis stretched a vast plain, traversed and irrigated by a network of canals. In times of war, Atlantis' chief kingdom could muster a navy of 1,200 ships and an army of well over 1 million men. The other 9 kingdoms were equally populous and powerful. The 10 kings of Atlantis, however, always maintained a truce among themselves, meeting every few years to sacrifice bulls to Poseidon and confirm their alliance. The Atlanteans grew steadily in wealth and might. In time, however, they became corrupt, and the gods were stirred to anger. Zeus convened the heavenly council, and the dialogue ends. Plato never finished the dialogue, and never mentioned Atlantis again. So, why did Plato incorporate a detailed story about a lost island empire into 2 of his dialogues? Did he really believe Atlantis existed? And if he didn't, why not make it clear to his readers that Atlantis was fictional? Atlantis was a parable. Plato's dialogues are designed to engage readers, and so lead them to the benefits of philosophy. In keeping with this purpose, Plato sometimes has one of his characters tell a story that illustrates or otherwise complements a discussion. Some of these stories are framed as myths or allegories. Others, though obviously fictional, are described as true. As a writer of dialogues, Plato did not have to commit himself to the truth of any of these tales. He could simply put a story in a character's mouth and treat it as a point for discussion. Wanting to explore how an ideal state would function in time of war, Plato described ancient Athens as a virtuous and well-governed city. He invented Atlantis, mighty but corrupt, as a counterexample. Atlantis, in short, was an illustration of how not to govern. It may have also been a caricature of contemporary Athens, which Plato regarded as badly managed and morally bankrupt. But whatever else it was not a description of any actual place. So, there you have it. Atlantis was a product of Plato's imagination. Widespread belief in Atlantis is a modern phenomenon, begun by a failed American politician in the 1880s, and carried through the 20th century by an eclectic cast of psychics, Nazis, treasure hunters, and true believers. For that story, tune in next time, when we'll discuss the modern hunt for Atlantis. Until then, as always, thanks for watching.